Hello again. So the next little part then is coordination of the cardiac cycle and electrocardiograms. So in the last part of this booklet, what we looked at was one cardiac cycle, which involves the three stages: diastole, atrial systole, and ventricular systole. So in one heartbeat, we have got a little bit where all the chambers of the heart are relaxed, then the atria contract, and then the ventricles contract. So the point of this part is finding out how that actually happens and why it's so important. Now, if you look at this diagram, what you can see first of all, once it gets back to the start, is that the heart fills with blood, everything's relaxed during diastole, and then the atria are going to contract, and then the ventricles are going to contract, and the blood gets pushed upwards and outwards. Now, it's really important that it's always in that process and in that order. If it wasn't, then your heart wouldn't be a very effective pump. So let's have a wee look at why it's so important and how it's controlled. So this is the coordination of cardiac cycle. Now, generally speaking, anytime we're talking about the coordination of the cardiac cycle, this is talking about the electric activity or electrical activity or conductivity of the heart tissue. Now, as we know, your heart can pump by itself. It doesn't require any input from your brain. Because the cardiac muscle can contract by itself and produce its own electrical impulses, it's known as myogenic. So, for the cardiac cycle to take place, diastole followed by atrial systole followed by ventricular systole, a coordinated wave of electrical activity or excitation has to pass through the heart. It's myogenic because it can produce this beat, or it can produce this electrical stimulation itself. And the heart has its own pacemaker, which is a small block of tissue in the wall of the right atrium, and it's called the sinoatrial node, or just the SA node. And it has an intrinsic rhythm built in, which results in them firing about 70 times per minute in humans. That's 70 times per minute. Basically, every time there's one impulse from the SA node, it creates one heartbeat. So because the SA node releases 70 impulses per minute, that equates to a heart rate of about 70 beats per minute. So here's a diagram of the heart. This part here is the right atrium, here's the left atrium, here's the left ventricle, and here is the right ventricle. So what's going to happen is this SA node up here is going to produce an impulse there, and it's going to spread over the atria, and when it spreads over the atria, it makes the atrial muscles contract. So the impulse is produced here in the SA node, it spreads over the atria, and the atria contract. Now, what's really important is that your ventricles contract from the bottom upwards. And the reason why that's important is, if they contracted from the top down, it would force the blood downwards. So what we want to happen is, the ventricles need to contract from the bottom up so that it can force blood up and out through the arteries. So it can't travel directly down. What has to happen is it has to go to the second area, which is known as the atrioventricular node, or sometimes just the AV node. So the SA node produces the impulse, it spreads over the atria and the atria contract. It then gets funneled to the AV node, which is in the top of the septum. And from there, the electrical impulse gets transmitted down these special fibers in the septum known as the bundle of His. From there, the impulse goes down to the apex, or the point of the heart. And from there, the fibers then branch off into the walls of the ventricles, and these fibers in the walls of the ventricles are called Purkinje fibers. When the impulses travel through the Purkinje fibers, the walls of the ventricles start to contract. And they contract from the bottom upwards to force blood up and out of the arteries. So if we look at that all again in one go, the impulse is produced here in the SA node. It spreads over the atria, and the atria contract. It then gets funneled to the AV node, and it travels down through the septum in the bundle of His, down to the apex of the heart, and when it reaches the apex, the bundle of His branch off into the Purkinje fibers, and the impulse travels from the bottom upwards through the walls of the ventricle, and blood gets pumped up and out into the arteries. Now, there's a few things which you might be wondering about here. Well, why doesn't the impulse just get produced in the SI node and just go straight down? Well, we know that we don't want that to happen. We know that the ventricles need to contract from the bottom up. But how is the heart actually designed to do that? And it's really, really simple. If we look at this photograph of the front of the heart, here's our right atrium, here's our left atrium, here's our left ventricle, and there's our right ventricle. So down here is the septum. So what happens is the impulse gets produced here. Let's use rainbow pen for this. In fact, that's a terrible choice. We'll use a white pen actually. So here's the SI node in the right atrium. It produces the impulse and it spreads across the atria, and the atria contract. So the atria contract and force blood down into the ventricles. But all this tissue here, this fat tissue, is non-conductive fat tissue. Now, this means that the impulse can't pass directly from the atria down to the ventricles. The only way the impulse can travel from the top of the heart to the bottom is via the bundle of His, which is found in the septum. And when it reaches there, it then gets transferred along the Purkinje fibers to the walls of the ventricles, and the ventricles contract, and they're going to contract from the bottom up and force blood upwards and outwards into the arteries. So, for the cardiac cycle to take place, we're relying on the SI node, which is the pacemaker, to produce the impulse. The impulse then has to spread across the atria. We rely on this non-conductive tissue to stop it going straight to the ventricles. And then we want the impulse to travel down the bundle of His, which is in the septum, and then branch off into the Purkinje fibers, and we want the ventricles to contract from the bottom up. So if we look at the notes for this, the SI node sends out a wave of electrical activity across the atrial muscle, causing the atria to contract. So the SI node sends out a wave of electrical activity, and then the atria contract at the same time, which is atrial systole. And then blood goes into the ventricles. Between the atria and the ventricles is the layer of non-conductive tissue, which is the yellow fat that prevents the wave of excitation passing directly through the ventricles. The only way electrical activity can pass through the ventricles is via the second control center called the AV node, which is located between the atria and the ventricles. After 0.1 seconds, the wave of electrical activity has reached the AV node. So that gives you an idea about how quick this is taking place. It passes, or it takes 0.1 seconds to pass from there across the atria to there. So it's very, very quick. The AV node is connected to special tissue in the septum called the bundle of His, and the electrical activity passes rapidly along the bundle to the bottom of the ventricles. The stimulation then spreads up through the walls of the ventricles in special tissue called Purkinje fibers, and both ventricles are stimulated to contract simultaneously, and the wave of ventricular contraction begins at the apex of the heart and spreads upwards to the arteries, which pass vertically out of the heart. Now this animation just shows what's happening then. So if we look at the diagram on the right, we can see the SA node, which is just above the right atrium. It sends out the impulse and it spreads across the atria, and the atria contract. It then reaches the AV node, passes down the bundle of His, up the Purkinje fibres, and the ventricles contract. So across the atria, to the AV node, down the bundle of His, to the apex of the heart, up the Purkinje fibres, and then it spreads over the ventricles and the ventricles contract. This one's also very good because this shows the blood flow in the heart. So this is diastole, where the heart is just filling with blood passively. The SI node produces the impulse and it spreads across the atria, and the atria contract, goes to the AV node, and then the impulse travels down through the septum in the bundle of His to the Purkinje fibres, and as it travels through the Purkinje fibres, the ventricles contract from the bottom up, which forces blood upwards and outwards. So here we are in diastole again. Heart's filling with blood. There's no impulses being produced until bam. Oh, terrible timing. Until the SI node produces it, spreads across the atria, down to the AV node, and then down the bundle of His, into the Purkinje fibres, and then the ventricles start to contract from the bottom up, forcing blood upwards and outwards. And this part just shows a little summary, so you'll find this in the back of your books. So from the SI node, the impulse is produced, the impulse passes over the atria, and at this point, atria contract, and blood goes from the atria to the ventricles. The impulse goes to the AV node. So remember, it has to go there so that because it can't get through the layer of non-conductive tissue, it travels down the bundle of His, which is in the septum, goes to the apex of the heart, and then travels through the Purkinje fibres, which are in the walls of the ventricle, and the ventricles contract, and the blood gets forced upwards towards the arteries. Now at that point as well, when the ventricles start to contract, that's when the AV valves are going to close as well. So when it passes over the ventricles, ventricles contract, and there we are. That's the end of the cycle. Now, remember this part where the impulse passes over the atria, that's going to be atrial systole. Where it passes over the ventricles, that's going to be ventricular systole. And then, once the ventricles are done contracting, we go into diastole before the cycle starts over again. Now, just to finish this bit off then, so when we were looking at the cardiac cycle, we said there was two heart sounds at B and D. So we had the lub and the dub. So this was the AV valves closing, and then at D was the semilunar valves closing. When they close, they make a heart sound. You can listen to those and you can view them on a phonocardiogram. But an electrocardiogram is sort of linked to what we've just looked at there. The electrocardiogram shows the electrical activity of the heart. It appears as a line with a wave of P showing excitation of the atria. QRS shows excitation of the ventricles, and T corresponds to diastole. So this is an example of a little ECG. So if you've ever had any heart problems or you've ever been in hospital or anything, they'll have a little heart rate monitor on them, which will be attached with, I think it's 6 or 7 leads around their chest, and it'll measure the heart, the electrical activity of the heart, and produce a little printout like this. What we're talking about, this PQRST, is this here. So each wave can be split up into the P, the Q, R, S, and the T. So the P represents excitation of the atria, QRS is excitation of the ventricles, and this T is relating to diastole. So in this diagram, we've got P, Q, R, S, T. And one heartbeat is basically from there to there. Or sometimes what they'll do is they'll measure the distance between the two R's. But if we look at this sort of shows you a few little things or different heartbeats or different ECGs that they can look like. So this is a normal heartbeat. Now in this, we would say that there is regular intervals between the waves. Or actually what's better to say is between the QRS. After that, we've got a fast heartbeat. Now, if you compare this with this, you can see here that there is roughly 1, 2, 3 and a bit squares between the QRS peaks. So in this case, this one's a faster heartbeat because there's only 1, 2 and a bit between them. So there's shorter intervals between QRS. Now, fast heartbeat can be caused by lots of different things. Some people just have a naturally fast heartbeat. As well as that, it could be caused by exercise. So if you start exercising more, you're obviously going to have a faster heartbeat when you're doing the exercise. Then we can have a slow heartbeat. So what we could say here is there is longer intervals between the QRS. So if you look at this, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and a bit. So if you were really, really fit and you were just sitting relaxing, you might have a slow heartbeat. An irregular heartbeat here is caused by irregular intervals or times between QRS. Okay, now what's important here is that it's the distance between these, right? Remember I said that every time an impulse gets produced by the SA node, it leads to a heartbeat. So this one is irregular, not because some of the peaks, like this one, go up to there, but this one goes up a bit higher. So it's not to do with the height of the peak, it's to do with the intervals between them. So how much time it takes between each heartbeat. And that is pretty much it for now. Thank you. Goodbye.